Opportunities and Challenges Facing Black Fundraisers. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Heaven. Anthony is a professor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, in which resides the fundraising school. And one of my responsibilities is to teach academic courses alongside Anthony and the rest of our faculty as we offer degree programs at the bachelor's, master's, and doctorate levels. And Anthony, thanks so much for being with us to translate your research for nonprofit organizations here through the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Bill, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Now, one of your areas of research involves the opportunities and challenges being faced and confronted and taken advantage of by Black fundraisers. So, kind of in the academy, we like that letter V. We start out at the top and then work our way down to the particular. So let me just ask you generally, what led you into this topic of research?
That's a great question, Bill. So I was actually in my master's program at UT Austin, and as a part of that program, I had to do an internship outside of the area that I was currently working in, which was student services. So I decided to intern with the development office, loved the work. That became an opportunity for me to work in that office during my doctorate. And one of my then supervisor, actually my very first supervisor in fundraising, said, she was a Black woman. She said, I'm going to take you to a variety of different meetings. I'm going to really expose you to the field of advancement. I want for you to pay attention to who's in the spaces that we're in and the interactions that are occurring within those spaces. And I will tell you, I quickly realized that the field was overwhelmingly women, but the majority of people in leadership were men, and there were very few people of color, even more so African Americans, within the space. And so that was how the dissertation topic was birthed. I really wanted to understand what were their experiences being one of few within the spaces. How did they navigate the challenges of being at a predominantly white institution? And ultimately, how did they conceptualize their role within the fundraising space?
All right. So how did you go about doing this research? How did you set up your study and ongoing studies as you looked into this topic?
Yes, great question. So I actually did a qualitative study. I wanted to focus at the rich description of their experiences. We decided to focus specifically on the American Association of Universities just to make sure I had the right scope for the study. And I did snowball sampling. So I put out a call for people who were African Americans working at an AAU institution in frontline fundraising. And from there, I was able to secure some participants and had an interview protocol and had a great but also stressful time facilitating the research because, I'm passionate about the topic, but there were some interesting findings that came out that were not particularly startling, but anytime I hear them, they shock me.
Before you get to the findings, help us understand, please, what types of questions were you asking?
Yes. So my three research questions were the overarching research questions were one, how do African American development officers describe their experiences working at predominantly white institutions? Two, how do they navigate their professional responsibilities within the context of a PWI? And lastly, how do they describe the experience? I'll start over again with that. Research question number three is how do African American development professionals describe the influence of their racial identity on their work? So these were the three questions that produced the rest of the questions that were my interview protocol.
And what did you find?
Well, I've had a total of 13 findings. So for research question one, there were three primary findings. So one is that African American development officers, of course, view themselves as connectors of people and sometimes catalysts of re-engagement, especially for marginalized populations of the institution. Predominantly white institutions can be an isolating space, which wasn't surprising, but some of the sub-findings were a bit shocking. And then lastly, for that first research question, racism and prejudice exist in more covert forms. So to give you kind of a little bit of a sense of what the findings specifically said, as one, of course, we know that predominantly white institutions can be an isolating space for African American frontline fundraisers. They talked about how oftentimes they were the only one in the space, and they were looked to be the voice of perspective for African American donors or for diverse donors overall. They talked about how frustrating it was, some of my participants having been in the field 15, 20 years, and never having more than one African American colleague on their team, right? So it's very isolating. As you know, we're attracted to homogeneity, right? So we're attracted to what's like us. And they would describe experiences being on team and being on teams, and the team leader would ask for people to get up and mingle, and they would be the last one that someone would come and speak to, right? Because they were different. So they talked about also racism and prejudice exist in more covert forms. So I like to say it's not our grandparents' racism. It's a little bit more subtle. It really lends itself to denial of credibility of African American fundraisers. It lends itself to sometimes racist encounters with donors where they may use racist language. And it also lends itself to internal colleagues being biased and actually talking about those biases in a way that doesn't mitigate them at all, but just expressing their biases in a way that's harmful. And so those were the research findings for that question one. For
Can I ask you to pause right there? Can we unpack these one category at a time? Because
yes,
there's so much that's good here. I want to be able to keep track of it all. When you mentioned that sense of isolation, so sad, intuitive. If I'm the only one, I'm going to feel isolated. Can you say more about these activities of racism? You touched on them a little bit in terms of, just flat out comments that people tragically make that can be very overt. But I guess what I'm trying to get at here, Anthony, are there things maybe we're even doing unintentionally that then come across as racist so that people candidly who look like me can go, oh, I didn't even know that was coming across as racist. Can you help us understand that a little bit, please?
Yes, yes. So I'll give you an example. In the dissertation, one of the stories that came out was actually about a colleague who made some problematic statements, right? They were racist in nature, and this colleague also said some sexist comments in nature as well. And no one ever challenged that colleague. And so one of the fundraisers in my study talked about looking around and feeling like, is it my responsibility to call out or to engage this behavior today? Right? They shouldn't have that responsibility, but in a lot of ways, they felt like they had to if it was going to be addressed. I will tell you, a lot of them talked about leaving meetings where comments would be made or where behaviors were displayed, and their colleagues would say, "We're sorry that happened," right after the meeting, but no one would ever check the behavior within the context of the meeting. So you have things like that occurring internally. We also had a situation to where one of the participants talked about lobotomizing her professional and personal identities, right? She said, I could not bring my entire self to work because I had colleagues and they would talk about the things that they were facing. But she recalled when Trayvon Martin was murdered, being really stressed out because at the time she was pregnant with a young Black boy. And she said she came to work and she's typically chipper. And so everyone noticed a shift in her demeanor and asked her what was wrong. And she said, I'm just thinking about how I'm going to have to raise, my son in this society and the conversations that I'm going to have with him. And they just basically dismissed what she said, right? Well, we have, we're not worried about our kids being assaulted. We have kids X, Y, and Z, but they did not get the core at what she was communicating about her experience as a Black woman within this space. And so she talked about how she realized very quickly that her colleagues could bring their stuff to work, their personal issues, their societal qualms, but she was not able to do that. The last story I'll tell is actually about a donor, right? There was a participant in the study. There was a donor who had been contributing for quite some years, called to talk to someone because he was upset that scholarships were going to the Black and brown kids who were athletes, right? That was his perception of how scholarships were allocated at that specific institution. So what ended up happening was over the course of this conversation, he talked about how it was important for him to build the argument for how this institution allocated scholarships, but it was also important for him to stand behind this concept of racial equity. And so he ended the conversation by talking about these brilliant students who have came through, who are all deserving of the scholarship money. And he disclosed that I too am an African American frontline fundraiser here, just so you know, right? Because that was important for him to let this guy know that he was grappling with someone from that background as well. And so these stories are not, one of a kind, unfortunately. They are prevalent. I've had experiences with donors where I've experienced them saying racist comments or sexist comments. I've also had colleagues who were biased, and I won't say that they were intentionally racist, but they were biased and just were not able to see beyond the scope of their own experiences.
Speak up in the moment. is one takeaway that I have, Anthony, with the concerns that you mentioned. Human decency alone says feel what the other person is saying when you talk about the mom and the pain that she was feeling, let alone as fundraisers. We're supposed to have high levels of emotional intelligence and empathy for other people. And a reminder to all fundraisers, whether it's racism, sexism, anything where a donor is crossing the line, we still have self-respect. We can still say no to that donor. We are never beggars that have to put up with any of those types of behaviors. Anthony, you two other categories. Thank you for kind of taking one at a time for my benefit here as I absorb all of your wonderful learnings. What was the second category of findings?
Yes, Bill. The only thing I add to what you just said, the other thing I think we're starting to see an awakening in the field is around what are the standards associated with donor behavior, right? I've been a consultant, I've traveled around, worked at different institutions, and I will tell you that about 60 to 70% of mid-level managers and up don't know if their institution supports them in setting standards with donors in terms of the way in which any sexist, racist, homophobic language, right? Creating standards around that. They don't know if their institution empowers them to do that, and it hasn't been a conversation that they've grappled with. And so we're seeing an emergence of more conversations around these topics and what is the general conduct that we're holding donors to, and how do we create consequences around define that code of conduct that we're establishing.
So glad you brought that up. Just a quick interjection to let our audience know that the Fundraiser Bill of Rights is in every one of our courses at the Fundraising School, with the Donor Bill of Rights, but also the Fundraiser Bill of Rights that addresses a lot of these serious issues. Anthony, thank you again for letting me pause in that area. We're very anxious to learn about these other two categories of findings.
Yes. So the research question number one, just as a reminder, how do African-American development officers navigate their professional responsibilities? I will tell you that they found that relationships are key to navigating their professional lives. And Bill, you're probably saying it's the field of fundraising, right? Relationships are key for everyone. But the participants found it even more imperative that they were careful in crafting meaningful relationships. And they talked about it. I love this framework, right? You have your coaches who are your hands-on. They're helping to directly guide you. Mentors, they're there to support you, but they're a little bit more of a distance in terms of a relationship. And then sponsors. And they really illustrated how important it was to have sponsors, especially in a field that is white dominated. Having these sponsors who will say, I'll call you up because I want you for this opportunity. I want to make sure that you are positioned well to be successful in X, Y, and Z spaces. And because we do work in the field and we do know that, we reproduce ourselves, right? In a lot of ways, whiteness will reproduce whiteness. And so it's important for us to think about the relationships that we're making and how we help to support people who don't necessarily look like us or have our same identities. They talked about connecting to the mission being imperative to persist, right? Especially in spaces where you likely will experience some form of racism. I have not met very many African-American development officers who have not had an incident with a donor or a colleague involving racism. And so they talked about the value of being able to connect to the mission and having to fully connect to the mission in order to persist in light of all of these challenges that we see in the field. I'll lump these two together, finding 6 and 7. So investing in themselves and advocating for themselves and others. So what was really interesting is that, and also pick your battles, which is finding 8. They talked about how oftentimes Blackness is associated with these stereotypes, right? I myself I witnessed this occurring. I had a couple of friends at an institution that I worked with. We would, after large team meetings, it would be a few of us standing around, and because they saw us and they would say, y'all look like y'all are getting into some trouble, right? And it's one of those like subconscious biases things. Like if it was a group of white women, they likely would not have said that. Because it was a group of Black men, our unconscious biases oftentimes said, oh, it's trouble, right? And so a lot of fundraisers have had these type of experiences, but they talked about the value of advocating for themselves and also others, right? One of the participants mentioned that there was a Black woman who had gotten a negative reputation for being angry within the field. And we know that that's coded in a lot of ways. And then once they talked to her, they realized she was not angry. She was very passionate and sharp and just talented at what she did, right? And so they talked about how having this narrative about you really sticks, even though only one or two people may have created it. It becomes this pervasive narrative because people are talking to other people, et cetera. And so they talked about also picking your battles, knowing. Going back to something we talked about earlier, Bill, knowing when to advocate and when this is an educational moment versus when to step back. I don't have the capital to fight this battle, or this isn't something I have the emotional energy to grapple with today. And then lastly, being aware of the perception of African American, right? One of the participants talked about it as baggage. He said, I don't want to describe it this way because I don't view it this way in and of itself. But in a lot of ways, it becomes baggage because people have these stereotypes and these images of you and they attach it to you. Even as a fundraiser, I will tell you, Bill, I've had people who have said some things to me that make me kind of tilt my head a little bit. What does that mean, right? Whether they're questioning my ability to do the job as a fundraiser, right? Or whether they're saying things like, oh, you're really good for a Black guy, right? I've had donors
Wow.
that before, right? And again, I don't think people consciously want to be perceived as racist, but I think what happens is when you're caught off guard and when you're not dealing with your own biases, these type of situations will happen. And so lastly, they talked about this, as W.E.B. Du Bois would say, double consciousness, right? Code switching and being able to move in different environments, and understanding that sometimes the social norms of those environments do not mirror the social norms of your environment. I will tell you that a lot of fundraisers will talk about not being used to a donor ordering what they wanted for the entire table to eat, right? That's a social norm that was not in their own culture, but was with that donor, right? That's how the donor perceived how they wanted to do meals. They also talked about how important it was to be perceived in a certain way by their colleagues because this certain perception lends itself to credibility. And so that sums up kind of research question one. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll move to research question three, unless you have something else, Bill.
We've got plenty of time to learn from you, Anthony. Thank you for your sensitivity to that. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, thank you for creating this awareness, right? For people who are interested in fellowship that I had from the Rockefeller Foundation taught us not to cross lines of difference, but to cross lines of distinction because we're distinct, right? Instead of being different, which can create separation. You're helping us see on the inside what so many colleagues are facing. What recommendations in this second category emanated that you are recommending to the nonprofit sector at large?
I think it's important, one, that we think about how we make water cooler talk more accessible to everyone in organizations, right? Because oftentimes what happens is because I like X person, they remind me of myself, I support them. And if we're thinking about all white leadership, to be frank, the people that they're supporting may not be diverse because, again, we're attracted to what's like us. So I think it's important to see beyond ourselves and to think about how do we provide access to information to all the people across our organization, right? I've been in situations where I know a colleague had a heads up on a promotional opportunity that was coming down the pipeline because of who they were connected to. So I think that's important. I think the second thing that would be important is that we are more intentional about creating mentorship relationships within the field of fundraising. I think Bill, you're probably thinking we naturally do this, which we do, but it's also important for us to think about how people climb the career ladder and how we're supporting diverse people within those spaces and providing them with the equitable resources necessary to succeed in those spaces. The other thing I will say is working through our own biases. I will tell you, we all have biases that we have to work through, right? I think it's important for us to have training on how we grapple with and work through our biases. And I'll give you an example of this in real time. So I was working at an institution. I was on a hiring committee. And there was someone on within the pool that was a great candidate. They were hands down great. But one of my colleagues made the comment that they do not fit the culture of the institution, right? And of course, I had to stir up something, right? I had to ask follow-up questions, right? So I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by the culture of the institution? And after we had some dialogue, what we realized is that they were saying that they were not like the other people who were at the institution, that this person was different and they didn't think that the energy was aligned well. of course, several of us pushed back. We needed that diversity within the office. We needed their perspective. We needed their different style. They were Midwestern versus Southern. I was at a Southern institution. And so I think it's important for us to work through these biases and be proactive about that as teams and not just as individuals.
And I will also add quickly an amendment. We want our teams to be making well-informed decisions. The best way to do that is to be well-informed. It's not circular reasoning. It means we're gathering people at the table with many different viewpoints, many different perspectives, many different life experiences. So, the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, not just the morally right thing to do. We could stop there, but it has this practical advantage as well, gathering all of these viewpoints and perspectives as we lead our organizations. And Anthony, you said there's a third category of findings as well.
Yes. So the question was, how do African American development professionals describe the influence of their racial identity on their work? And so the first finding, which was also equally disturbing and startling, was that race and gender were salient for African American women development officers. And so when they talked about their experiences, oftentimes race and gender were intermingled, and they had a tough time divorcing the two, right? I'll give you an example directly from the dissertation. So there was actually a participant who was at a fundraising event where there was alcohol. A donor got very touchy under the influence of alcohol and at some point grabbed her by her waist, pulled her in and said, "They didn't make him like you when I was a student here," right? He went to a segregated version of that institution, right? And so, I have that quote in the dissertation, but we also did some follow-up and in the conversation, the donor basically had a different gift officer. They did not have any sort of repercussions for that donor. And when the gift closed a couple of months later, she didn't get any credit for that gift, right? So we start running into, one, the hypersexualization of Black women in our history and how they're treated, how they're othered in some of these spaces by our colleagues. But we also start dealing with what are the professional ramifications for these experiences on their career and their career opportunities. They also talked about how it was important as a Black woman that they looked more credible. And so they didn't want to look too pretty. So oftentimes they would put their hair up in a ponytail or wear glasses to be perceived as more credible, right? The other two findings from this area were race as an asset and race as a liability, right? Which seem contradictory, but and oftentimes African American gift officers operate within one of those two spaces at different times in their career, right? I will give you an example. So I was working at an institution and I met with this donor who was shocked that I was African American man in this position. I will tell you that there had only been two of us at the institution. The other one left, 8 years prior to me arriving. But you could see that he immediately wanted to have some tough conversations about institutional policies, racism, the history of the institution. And I will tell you, Bill, within the first 20 minutes of our conversation, he used the N-word in telling a story. I like to say he ran through the N-word like it was a green light. Just used it again. I think he used it a total of 3 times in telling these stories. What I realized very quickly was, one, he thought it was appropriate because he was retelling the story. But two, he never had anyone who would sit down and grapple with him about these topics, right? And he was an interesting case study of a donor who actually wanted to learn. Like, he was not just there to leverage power or to say what he wanted to say. He actually wanted to learn. And I may not have been able to sway any of his personal opinions, Bill, but I will tell you that by the time we met for the last time, before I changed jobs, he asked me if they had relocated the statue because he understood, to your point earlier, the business model, right? I may not get doing it just because it's the right thing to do. I think it's part of our history, but I get that this is not a symbol that is equitable or inclusive for our students, nor is it who we want to be in the future. So I understand the business model of it.
Anthony, you've given us a wonderful opportunity to see that while there has been tremendous progress, that progress still has ways to go. What do you hope happens with the findings of these studies? And again, here at the Fundraising Schools podcast, we have nonprofit leaders, we have frontline fundraisers. What can they do with these findings? What would you like to see happen?
So I think one is, if you have interest, I will be launching another study, a follow-up, so a post-racial reckoning study to see where we are now. So I think one, if you have interest, reach out. We'd love to have you participate in that. I think to recap some of what we talked about earlier is think strategically about our biases and not pull back from those trainings and workshops and exercises, but really lean in because it's going to help us be great colleagues, better fundraisers, but also better global citizens, right? To have this cultural competency will help us be better global citizens. I think it's important for institutions to work with their gift officers to understand their stories and experiences, because as we know, institutional cultures vary. We know regional cultures vary. Regional history is different. And so it's important to have these conversations to create open dialogue with your fundraisers about what they're encountering and experiencing. I will say there's an institution that I worked at that did this really well, Arizona State University. I'll never forget. As a part of my orientation, we were in a session where people were telling their fundraising stories about traumatic things that had happened in the field, whether it be racism, sexism, homophobia. And they said that no gift is large enough for us to not return it, right? We will investigate. We want to protect our people.
Yep.
You are a number one priority. So I think that the next step would be creating protective measures and really embracing that fundraisers bill that you talked about earlier, right? A lot of institutions should really adopt it, embrace it, and think about how do we create community norms that help us be the people that we want to be as our institutions, as our organizations, and help to move this work forward. Because again, these are narratives that we don't oftentimes hear about. I mean, we don't hear fundraisers talk often at all, but even more so to look at the experiences of marginalized fundraisers who operate within a structure that has some components that still need to evolve and be worked on.
Dr. Anthony Heaven has enlightened us on this very important topic associated with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging by looking specifically at fundraisers who are Black and some of the opportunities, the positives that they see, but also the challenges that they still face. And Anthony, thanks so much for being with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Now, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging are woven through each of our courses at the Fundraising School and at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And we also want to let you know the School of Philanthropy is home to the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy, which is studying so many different aspects of diversity as it relates to philanthropy, generosity, the nonprofit sector, and fundraising. As for the Fundraising School, we have 24 public courses. They lead to 5 certificates. We have custom training that we can bring just to your nonprofit, your region, your association. We have quarterly webinars, these weekly podcasts, all of this information gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now in the book's 5th edition. Where do you find all of this? Here's the website, go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. I'm grateful for my colleagues, the Emmy Award-winning producer, Mike Anthony, as well as my colleague, Jennifer Boffman, CFRM. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.